1932 is an election year, and with the Great Depression in full swing, the nation gathered, as it generally does every 4 years, to quote Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who traveled in America in the 1840s. He said every 4 years Americans gather together and vent their spleen over a political election, and then they return to their normal apathy. But for the election of 1932, Americans were intently interested in going to the polls and expressing their opinion one way or the other. And so in 1932, the Republicans, after the fiasco of the bonus army, after the fiasco of the Great Depression, after Hoover's failed attempts at the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, as author Amity Shlaes so eloquently discusses in her book, The Forgotten Man, she says that Hoover's attempts at reform, in fact, made the Great Depression worse. So the Republicans have to decide going into the 32 election, who are we going to nominate? What sacrificial lamb will be sent up to be slaughtered by the Democrats? And the Republicans decide that they don't want to sacrifice any of their up-and-coming stars, so they renominate Herbert Hoover for re-election. Hoover, who doesn't stand a chance. Poor Hoover. He's ready to step aside, but he takes one for the team. And so the grand old party, the Republicans, nominate Hoover in a mood of abject defeat. On the other side, however, the Democrats nominate a former vice presidential candidate in 1920, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, a shining star of the Democratic Party in the intervening time between 1920 and 1932, in his run for vice president and his run for the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt had contracted polio. And so in the 32 election, with the support of the media never revealed that Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair, that Franklin Roosevelt was paralyzed. And Franklin Roosevelt could stand, he could drive with the aid of a special car, he could even appear to walk as long as he was between two people. He could shuffle his legs along and have the appearance of walking. And in the campaign of 1932, he would appear before audiences across the nation on the back of a train, on a railway car, where he was already in place when it pulled up, and he would address the crowds. Or in a convention center, he would be behind the curtain, and when the curtain opened, there's Roosevelt standing at the lectern. They never saw him actually walk out to the lectern. And so the first handicapped president running for election in 1932, choosing as his running mate Texan John Nance Garner, Roosevelt breaks all tradition when he appears before the nominating convention in Chicago, the Democratic nominating convention of 1932 in Chicago. He appears before them to make an acceptance address, and he said the following. He said, and I quote, "Let it be symbolic that I broke traditions. Republican leaders not only have failed in material things, they have failed in national vision, because in disaster they have held out no hope. I pledge you, I pledge myself, I pledge a new deal for the American people." And so in his acceptance speech, Franklin Roosevelt spells out the name of his future legislative program, the New Deal. What brings such magnetism and such popularity for Franklin Roosevelt is his unbridled optimism. In the end, we can look at this, and please hear this. The New Deal, all of the programs that are instituted beginning in 1933 with Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration. Sorry, spoiler alert, he's going to win the presidency. But from that point on, everything that Franklin Roosevelt does to micromanage the economy, all of his programs, all of his throwing money at relief, recovery, and reform, are not going to end the Great Depression. There is no program of the New Deal that brings the Depression to an end. In fact, it will be the onset of World War II and the spending for World War II, both abroad spending and in the United States, that ends the Great Depression, not a program. In fact, economist and historian Amity Shlaes, in her book, The Forgotten Man, says that in fact Franklin Roosevelt and a lot of his programs made the Depression worse. If he had just left it alone, it would have played itself out. Companies that should have failed would have failed and would have been replaced. But because the government tinkered, because the government messed with the system, it will make the Great Depression last longer than any depression in American history. But it's Roosevelt's optimism that it can be fixed, that it will be fixed, that he's the one to fix it, that Franklin Roosevelt cares about the common folk, and that he's going to bring relief. In fact, his campaign slogan is, "Happy days are here again." And so this overwhelming spirit of optimism and that he is the one. And so as the campaign of 1932 unfolds, you see that in his bifurcated campaign. He has two campaign ideas. One is, hey, elect me, I can fix the Great Depression. I know the solution to all things. It didn't matter that he didn't really know. No one put him on the record and said, well, exactly what are you going to do? He didn't have to spell it out. What the American people knew is he wasn't Herbert Hoover. And that leads to Roosevelt's other campaign idea, is that Herbert Hoover is the devil. Herbert Hoover's the one to blame for the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover's the one who hasn't fixed anything. Herbert Hoover is responsible. Replace Herbert Hoover with me and I will fix everything. And that leaves poor Herbert Hoover to run on the slogan, "Don't swap horses. Stand by Hoover." Whoops, that's a bad call. And on election day, the American people responded, and they responded overwhelmingly. That's a spanking of national proportions. Roosevelt just dominated Hoover. Voters just didn't care about the content of speeches. They didn't care about anything but that FDR wasn't Hoover and FDR had a plan. And so Franklin Roosevelt will be the last president to take office on March 4th, 1933, the last president to take office in March. With the inauguration of FDR, Congress passes the 20th Amendment, which moves Inauguration Day to January, to shorten the lame duck period. Unfortunately, I think that's a bad idea, a really bad idea. The idea was you don't want the old president just hanging around for 4 months waiting for the next president to come in. Let's reduce that amount of time. Well, the Founding Fathers in their wisdom put that period there for a reason. The lame duck period of the presidency is there to calm the passions of the people. In a very emotional election, if the wrong guy wins, they want a 4-month period of cooling off before the new guy takes office. And more importantly, and this is in the writings of the Founding Fathers as they discuss the creation of the presidency, they want a time for the incoming president, for the election to be vetted, to make sure that there weren't any errors, that there wasn't any cheating or especially foreign influences in the election. But nonetheless, Roosevelt takes office March of 1933. Happy days are here again, and we're ready to begin a new era of the presidency. Roosevelt fills his cabinet with able-bodied men, but while they are the official government organs, they are the ones responsible, Roosevelt doesn't always look to them for advice. On the ideas and the concepts of the New Deal, he looks to a group of Columbia and Harvard professors called the Brain Trust. The Brain Trust, 3 men in particular, Raymond Moley, Rexford Tugwell, and A.A. Burrell. Moley, Tugwell, and Burrell were the primary brain trust, and they advised the president on economic matters and social matters. And Roosevelt's prevailing temperament was, and I quote, "The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold and persistent experimentation." And so this cartoon reflects that idea. Let's try anything. Before our patient wakes up, let's try anything. Now notice in this cartoon, all of the doctors waiting to operate on the nation. We know Uncle Sam's the patient, draped in the sheet USA. But all of those doctors, labeled as New Dealers, wear mortarboards and tassels. They are academics. This cartoon is taking a shot at the Brain Trust. Notice what the cartoon says. New Deal Clinic. And they're all waiting to try their pet experiment. Notice the guy at the back of the line. I hope he doesn't wake up before I get a chance to, I hope they don't wear him out before I get a chance to try my experiment. And notice at the bottom, the bottle named ether. Ether was a common drug in the 1930s to put people to sleep before operations. And so the ether here to keep the American people asleep is the ether of propaganda. And Franklin Roosevelt was a master at propaganda. Not only from his campaign slogan and this aura of optimism, but as he takes office, a lot of his creations, a lot of his attempts under the New Deal legislation are going to be grounded and rooted in propaganda. And his chief propaganda tool will be the fireside chat. Doesn't that sound warm and inviting? Doesn't that sound like something you want to do, especially on a cold winter's day? Listen to, because he takes office in March. It's still cold, especially in New England in the Northeast and West. It's still winter. And don't you want to gather around the radio and listen to Papa FDR tell you how good things are going to be and spell out an agenda for the nation and tell you exactly what he's doing, why he's doing it, and what your part is in the program? So unlike Hoover's reticence, his reclusiveness, Roosevelt's going to be open with the American people, at least present an aura of openness. And that the idea, are these people gathered around firesides? No, but this is a day and time in which every house had a fireplace. And so that's where the family gathered, and there was warmth, and there was family, and there was comfort in the fireside chat. And that's the idea here. Roosevelt's going to give you that warmth. He's going to give you that comfort. He's going to give you that sense of you're suffering, but you're a part of it, and I'm going to help you be a part of the fix. And so a lot of Roosevelt's programs that are utter disasters, that they in fact make the Depression worse, the American people don't lay the blame at Roosevelt because Roosevelt cares. And in fact, almost immediately, Roosevelt calls upon Congress to make a fundamental change in the nation. February 6, 1933, the 20th Amendment was ratified, but as he takes office, Roosevelt calls upon Congress to ratify the next amendment, the 21st Amendment, and repeal prohibition. Now, why? Why repeal prohibition? Prohibition worked. Prohibition was successful in its outlined goals. So why repeal prohibition? Why make the consumption of alcohol legal again? Well, in the Roman Empire, it was bread and circuses that kept the Roman populace entertained when the government struggled. And so one of the ideas here is replace that, in addition to the ether of propaganda, give the nation the ether of alcohol. And so the public sale and consumption of alcohol will be one of the first legislative accomplishments of the Roosevelt administration. And he will call upon Congress to pass the 21st Amendment and explain to the American people in his first fireside chat of March 12, 1933, of why it was necessary. So first off, a repeal of prohibition and the beginnings of the sale of alcohol and wine and intoxicating beverages again. A second propaganda tool was the call upon Congress to create a banking holiday. A banking holiday. And so in one of his, probably his second act in Congress, he calls upon his second act to address Congress. Within 7 hours of debate, Congress will pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, in which FDR declared a banking holiday, saying we're going to have an extended weekend, a 4-day weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Over those 4 days, federal examiners are going to go from bank to bank to bank and examine the books of those banks. And on Tuesday morning, when the banks reopen, only those banks with sound deposits are going to be allowed to reopen. Only banks that are secure will reopen. Let's think about that. How many banks are there here in Tyler? How many banks are there in Texas? How many banks are there in the nation? Over a 4-day holiday, even in 1933 with the wave of bank failures, there are still tens of thousands of banks. And so we're led to believe that federal investigators go to all of those banks, and when on Tuesday morning the banks reopened, after this fireside chat, after the urging of FDR to trust the banks, he told the American people, when the investigators are finished, those banks that reopen, it will be, and I quote, safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under your mattress. Simple fact is, those investigators didn't go to all those banks, and some banks that were questionable reopened, but on that Tuesday morning, for the first time since 1929, deposits exceeded withdrawals as more money came into the banks that made even shaky banks solvent. What made that possible? Not the federal investigators, but Roosevelt's aura of confidence, his propaganda. And so Roosevelt's approach to the New Deal is try anything. Make sure if it doesn't work, then discard it. If it does work, then keep it. Now, not everybody's going to be on board with the New Deal. As we get into the first 100 days, of Roosevelt's presidency is the measuring stick by which all other presidents are now measured. There's a great book by Frank Leuchtenberg called In the Shadow of FDR, in which he talks about how all presidents that have followed Franklin Roosevelt, various things from Roosevelt's presidency are used to compare. And one of those chief items is the first 100 days of the presidency. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency is when he got most of his legislative agenda before Congress. Now, before we move on, that this cartoon from the Chicago Tribune of April of 1933, what you see in the cartoon is opposition to the New Deal. You have New Dealers shoveling money out of the American economy, spin, 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 and you have in the far, you have Joseph Stalin looking toward the east, and he's saying, "Oh, how pink the sunrise is." that the United States, this bastion of capitalism, is going red. They're not red yet, but they're at least pink. And writing on the placard is Leon Trotsky, the architect of Stalin's rise to power. Later killed by Stalin, but Leon Trotsky writing on the placard. The agenda of the communist, or in this case, the socialist within the Roosevelt government. Spin, spin, spin. Under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, and declare a dictatorship. This is, we look back at it and said, oh, Roosevelt wasn't a dictator. He wasn't a tyrant. Really? Look at the world of 1928, 29, 30 through 33. This is the rise of Benito Mussolini, the rise of Joe Stalin in the Soviet Union, Benito Mussolini in Italy, the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. Tyrants are rising everywhere. Why not the United States? The United States is in the midst of an economic depression unlike anything the world has seen. Roosevelt acquires to himself more and more and more power. Sure, there was a fear that he would be a dictator. And there's going to be a very real moment toward the end of the lecture today when the Roosevelt tries to control the Supreme Court. This cartoon and the idea behind this cartoon comes to remind everybody these new dealers running the Democratic donkey on the economy and shoveling out the money, drunk on power, could possibly be a danger as Roosevelt tries to take control of the last branch of government that remains independent, the Supreme Court. Dictators rising around the world. The fear, and it's a healthy fear. It doesn't mean it's going to come true, but it's a healthy paranoia of Roosevelt's intentions. And so Roosevelt is going to introduce a legislative agenda that you can divide his legislative agenda into three basic categories: relief, recovery, reform. And you see the long list of programs that he introduced. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's not intended to be. It's just to give you a rough idea of the volume of programs that he creates. Programs that fundamentally change the nature of the nation. Before this, the laissez-faire approach that had been modified by progressivism, the New Deal takes progressivism to its next level. In fact, you could argue, I would argue, that out of the Second Great Awakening of the 1830s and the 1840s and the rise of the prohibitionist, abolitionist, and suffragists, come the rise of control of government. That in those three groups, coming out of the Second Great Awakening, which says, humans can be perfected in this life, and that government can change the way people are impacted. And you see that in the progressives we've already talked about. Well, the New Deal is taking that idea yet one step further, and to put it in global context. And I'm not asking you to make a value judgment one way or the other, but in this idea that humanity can be perfected through social engineering, where the New Deal stops in 1937 and 38, it will be picked up by one of Franklin Roosevelt's protégés, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in the Great Society of the 1960s. And then you could even make the argument that the children of the 60s that grow to political awareness in the 60s, those children of the Great Society are the leadership of today. And you're going to see similarities between legislation passed today and Great Society programs, New Deal programs, and progressive ideas. So all of this put forward to change the relationship of the electorate to the government and the government to the electorate. Now, these programs are designed to provide relief to the people who are suffering, recover the national economy, and reform the way business is done. And we're not going to look at all of these. We're going to look at select ones of these. But between March 9th and June 16th, in the 100 days, Congress passed more than a dozen of FDR's major proposals. The one with some of the farthest reach was the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, building on the Emergency Banking Act that had been passed initially as Roosevelt came in as a relief measure. The reform side of it is the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which created an institution you see today. If you go into a bank, most banks have on their windows FDIC insured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured. That was a part of the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured a person's deposits in a bank up to $5,000. It's more than that today, but $5,000 in the day. It required commercial banks to separate themselves from investment brokerages and to be open and honest about their bank dealings so that the depositors can decide whether it's a sound bank or an unsound bank. FDR then went a step further, going back to the idea that the Great Depression is caused by the stock market crash, which we know it didn't, but the idea that the stock market was intricate in the onset of the Great Depression. Roosevelt urged Congress to pass the Federal Securities Act that required new stocks and bonds issued to register with the Federal Trade Commission, and then later the Securities and Exchange Commission, created by the Securities and Exchange Act. By the way, with all of these programs, you have to have an act first. The act then creates an administration that administers the program. And so it's a massive increase in government existence and government involvement, as a massive bureaucracy is created to deal with all of these ideas. Harking back to the progressives, throughout 1933, Franklin Roosevelt tinkered with the currency, and then on April 19th, 1934, the United States officially departed from the gold standard, something that William Jennings Bryan had wanted since the 1880s. The federal government officially abandoned the gold standard. To provide relief, one of the chief programs to provide relief was the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a program for young men between the ages of 18 and 25 who had little education or vocational background. And over the course of its existence, these young men would come in. They were generally inner city youth, recruited from the major metropoli. They would be brought to these camps out in the wilderness. Serves multiple purposes. You get the unruly element out of your cities. They're out working now. By signing the contract, you placed yourself under government discipline. Notice in these pictures, what do you see in these pictures? You see an army barracks style community with the young men in uniform standing at attention as roll call is taken each morning. They're awakened to reveille. They then show up for parade. Notice in the upper picture on the left, they are standing at attention with, instead of rifles, they have picks, they have shovels, they have rakes. They submit to regular hygiene lectures. They're taught regular hygiene. They're taught regular manual of arms. In fact, they are taught the manual of arms for a rifle, but instead of a rifle, they have a shovel. Now, not to traumatize you, but I'm going to jump to a slide, and then we're going to come back. At the very same time, on the other side of the globe, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler is training the future soldiers of the Wehrmacht, not with rifles, because that was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, but with shovels, but with axes, but with picks. And then very soon, he's going to defy the Treaty of Versailles and replace these shovels with rifles. So too, possibly, Franklin Roosevelt? Is this a precursor to a large standing national army? Who knows? Who knows? But notice the similarities. Notice the similarities. Over the course of the CCC's existence, 3 million workers would perform a variety of jobs in the woods. They would construct forests, bridges, roads, camping facilities, fisheries. They'd plant trees. They'd go out into wilderness areas and construct trees to promote soil conservation. They would go into areas to fight forest fires. They in essence, in some of the wilderness areas, would construct mountain roads. I was a couple of years ago in the San Juan National Forest outside of Durango, Colorado. And as we snowmobiled up in the mountains, there were overlooks built by the CCC and the Public Works Administration, all these New Deal projects. You can still see their handiwork up in the wilderness. And so the CCC provided relief because these men are paid weekly for their work. By contract, 95% of their paycheck was sent back to mom and dad in the inner cities. So you're providing relief to those in the inner cities. You've got your potentially dangerous population out of the cities, and they get a small pittance to spend at the PX for, shaving equipment and for pop and for candy and goodies like that that's not provided by the government. So the Civilian Conservation Corps. Another of the massive government agencies would be the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was a broad agency headed by Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was the second most powerful individual in the administration. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration would fund some 5,000 public buildings being constructed, 7,000 bridges. They would fund adult literacy programs, finance college education for the poor, and they would help local agencies disperse needed aid to the populace. But the first real large-scale program would be not the Works Progress Administration, but the Civil Works Administration. The Civil Works Administration, created in 1933, it offered federal jobs at competitive wages with the private sector. It would only last for 4 months. And in that 4 months, it would hire some 4 million workers. The agency would spend some $900 million on projects, everything from teaching to public works, overlapping some of what the CCC does, overlapping what some of the other programs, future programs, the Work Progress Administration will do. But here's the problem. This was the first massive works program. And as it grew to its largest extent, the agency would be responsible for teaching jobs, rural school programs. But as the cost soared, approaching $1 billion, Roosevelt became worried that it would be a deal breaker, that it would break the economy. And so Roosevelt terminated the program of the Civil Works Administration in the spring of 1934. Emily Schlaze is one to points this out, that you can graph the recovery of the United States, and as it's going up, as these programs are being implemented and recovery seems to be underway, the Civil Works Administration taking 4 million men out of the workforce, and putting them to work, and all of that money being pumped back into the economy. It seems like it's doing its job, But Roosevelt, as the cost soars, he gets cold feet. And when the program is cut in April 1934, you get this flat line right, or drop right back into depression. And so in 1935, FDR calls for a new entity to replace the Civil Works Administration, and that would be the Works Progress Administration. Headed by Harry Hopkins, it would replace the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and the WPA would do all. It would construct roads, bridges, theater projects, it would create the National Youth Administration for training jobless youth. It would hire college professors to keep them at work. They would hire school teachers to keep them employed. And over the course of its existence from 1935 to 1943, it would employ some 10 million jobless. Now, only 3 million at any one time, but over the course of its existence, 10 million people would work for the Works Progress Administration. There are a number of agencies that were highly controversial, and one of the agencies that set off a national debate was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. One of the problems with the national economy is that farm prices from 1929 onward, farm prices had been depressed, had been at rock bottom. Farmers were mortgaging their crops, were mortgaging their farms, mortgaging their houses, with no hopes of ever repaying, no hopes of ever recovering. And so to stop the reduction of the farms and to stop the elimination of farm growing and stop the elimination of farm existence, the AAA, and be careful with the initials, there are multiple AAAs. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. It sought to cut back on production by paying farmers and ranchers not to grow crops. And so in 1933, they went to farmers producing cotton, for instance. We want to bring cotton prices up. So if you reduce supply, it creates a false demand in this case because you're purposefully destroying crops. You create a false demand, and with a false demand, prices go up, which means farmers are going to get more money. So the idea behind the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is to have farmers plow under their cotton crop for 1933. So as they are about to harvest their crop, the government comes in, buys the crop, has them plow it under. So too with corn, so too with wheat, so too with oats, so too with hog farmers, so too with cattle farmers, sheep farmers, etc. Any of these commodities that are depressed, they have the farmers, in the case of a hog farmer, the government goes in and just leaves them a minimal herd, takes the rest of the herd out into the pasture, digs a big hole, slaughters the herd, covers them over. The farmer's not even allowed to use the meat. They don't take the meat. While they're starving in the cities, while the people are hungry, the government is buying crops and destroying them. Taking even already harvested wheat, setting it ablaze to create a false demand. To pay for this, the Agricultural Adjustment Act will place a fee on processing. A fee on processing. A tax on processing. That those who chose not to participate and those who did produce, when they harvested their flour and took it to the mill then placed a tax on that crop that was passed on to the consumer. Ultimately, that's going to be the Agricultural Adjustment Act's Achilles heel. In the court case U.S. versus Butler, 1936, the Agricultural Adjustments Act's processing tax is deemed unconstitutional. And with the method of payment being unconstitutional, the government couldn't pay to have the crops destroyed. And so as a stopgap measure, Congress passed the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936. This act took out the processing tax and just paid for it out of the general fund, paying farmers to rotate their crops, paying farmers to let their land lie fallow, and paying farmers not to produce as much. And in fact, farm prices did increase 58% between 1932 and 1935. So the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, and then ultimately it will be replaced by a second Agricultural Adjustment Act. One of the more controversial acts that the Roosevelt administration would pass is the National Industrial Recovery Act. The National Industrial Recovery Act. Now, the National Industrial Recovery Act has two parts. It creates two separate entities. So the overarching act creates on one part, it creates the Public Works Administration. The Public Works Administration received some $3.5 billion to build high-profile projects. Some of the projects, by the way, that it will complete under the direction of Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, I-C-K-E-S, Harold Ickes. They would build the Virginia Skyline Drive, the New York Triborough Bridge, the overseas highway between Key West and Miami, and the Chicago subway system. Very high-profile creations that were beyond the ability of state and local agencies to pay. But in this case, the federal government through the Public Works Administration. But the other administration created by the National Industrial Recovery Act was the NRA, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association. This was the National Recovery Administration. The National Recovery Administration was an attempt by the federal government to nationalize industry. You say, what industry? All industry. It attempted to set a standard of business and a code of standards nationwide. Now, my wife is an electrical engineer. She, every day when she goes to work and they have a project comes up, one of the books she discusses, and it's a huge, huge manual, is the National Electrical Code. And that's one of the outplays of the NRA, is an attempt to standardize across the board. If you work building refrigerators, then refrigerators have to use certain parts. If you process meat, all meat has to be processed by government standards. It was an attempt to set a code of conduct and a code of standards nationwide, every industry. Then along with it, it implemented some of the wish list of the progressives. It set nationwide the 40-hour work week as an industrial standard. Now I can tell you, as a professional, my wife's a professional, very rarely do either one of us work a 40-hour week. It's usually much longer than that, and we don't get paid for it. In her case, she's classified as a professional salaried employee, so she receives salary. I'm a contract employee, so I receive a set contract. We work far more than the 40-hour standard. But in this day and time, it sets that 40-hour work week as the national standard, and it set a minimum weekly wage. Not a minimum hourly wage, but a minimum weekly wage of $13 an hour. $13 a week for northern employees, $12 a week for southern employees. The National Recovery Administration is headed by Hugh Johnson, and it was a massive program accompanied by massive propaganda. And you see on the slide a number of the ideas put forward by the propaganda machine, the buttons that I have pictures of, the employee buttons, that if a company abided by the NRA standards, the employees would receive these buttons that, I work for a company that's following these standards. Then you would also receive the placard, the NRA Blue Eagle. I know it looks black, but it's supposed to be blue. The NRA Blue Eagle, some derisively called it the NRA Blue Chicken, but we do our part. And they would put this in your storefront, and the idea is that the American public, rewarding those companies that cooperated with the NRA, would come in and purchase at this store because it follows NRA standards, and not at that other store because it doesn't. Public pressure. And then, of course, I had to include the human art. This is a thing that was incredibly popular in the 1920s and 1930s, is creating human sculptures. Masses of people organized, and usually, and you can't tell on this one, but they would wear different color clothing to represent, in this case, they're all wearing supposedly blue to represent the NRA Blue Eagle. There's an amazing photograph that I didn't include in here, but the Statue of Liberty created by World War I enlistees, and because they have different colors of khaki, the photographer and artist took those different colors of khaki and put them together, making shading, and they formed the Statue of Liberty out of soldiers, and then took a picture of it from a balloon. Absolutely incredible. Some of these were very intricate, but the idea is community involvement, community support. The problem with the NRA and its national standards and its national it's a SOP. It's an attempt to legitimize and unionize the nation. Even those parts of the nation that were against unions. It's an attempt to create national unions as well as national codes. The NRA is going to be challenged, the act itself and the administration, the NIRA and the NRA, are going to be challenged in an amazing court case in May of 1935. The court case is Chester Poultry Corporation versus U.S. Chester, S-C-H-E-C-H-T-E-R, Chester Poultry Corporation versus U.S., sometimes called the sick chicken case. In the case, these two brothers, Jewish kosher merchants, were selling chickens to the public, but they weren't selling those chickens and processing them in ways that followed the National Recovery Administration's Code of Conduct for poultry processors. You see, because they're kosher they're kosher merchants, which means they wait to slaughter the chicken. They buy their chickens live from merchants that are guaranteed to have raised these chickens only on kosher products and follow biblical rules in raising these chickens. Then they take those chickens before a rabbi. The rabbi blesses the chickens, and then the chickens are slaughtered according to rabbinical code. Usually, the person who's buying them will come in and pick the chicken they want. They will then take the chicken to the back, slaughter it, and present it to the person fresh. The person takes it home and cooks it. This didn't follow government standards. There's nothing wrong with it. It didn't follow the standards it's set out by the bureaucracy. So in Chester Poultry Corporation versus U.S., the Chester brothers, who are being put out of business by the NRA, they have no law experience and they don't have the money to hire a lawyer. So they go to the library, study the law, and challenge the government, David versus Goliath, challenge the government with a court case. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and Charles Evans Hughes, writing the opinion of the majority, says that the NIRA and the NRA violate the Constitution in three ways. First off, the NIRA and the NRA and its codes are unconstitutional because the legislature, rather than creating these codes, allowed the chief executive to create the codes. That this was a matter of law, not executive decree. And what FDR would do is allow the electrical union to write the code, and then he would issue it as an executive order. And so Charles Evans Hughes says it was unconstitutional because it delegated authority from the legislature to the executive that wasn't constitutional. Number two, it said that the method, that the way the Schuster brothers did business, they bought chickens either already in state or they bought chickens out of state, but they brought them in state, and the processing occurred exclusively in New York City. And thus the Schuster brothers sold to customers exclusively in New York City. Therefore, there is no interstate commerce, and the Constitution does not give the federal government the power to regulate intrastate commerce. And thus, secondly, it's unconstitutional based upon that. And third, that the NRA violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. And so, in a unanimous decision, the court declared the NRA unconstitutional. And so the administration and all of its projects and all of its programs, there are a few projects and programs that are declared unconstitutional by the court. But as the Roosevelt administration progresses in the first New Deal, there are just overwhelming volumes of legislation coming out, and it produces a reaction, especially as we head toward the next election of 1934. As Roosevelt seems to be unstoppable, there are a group of dissidents that arise to question not only his motives, but whether he's gone too far. And the first of those dissidents are from the Democratic Party. Let's face it, the Republican Party has had the daylights pounded out of them in the 1932 election. The Republicans are afraid to do anything that looks anti-New Deal, and so establishment Republicans don't want to rock the boat. They're not voicing any type of opposition whatsoever. So instead, it's left up to an organization calling itself the American Liberty League. These are Democrats. You're familiar with Al Smith. You're familiar with John Davis. They're both former Democrats who ran for president. And they both are against the New Deal. They declared that the New Deal violates the Constitution because it seizes the most important of private property, a person's money, through unfair taxation. Taxing the wealthy to redistribute to the poor, while a grand idea is simply unconstitutional, according to these guys. And the American Liberty League, who in 1930s are afraid of the administration and its retaliation. So while these two guys are the most vocal supporters of it, the membership list of the American Liberty League was kept secret. They were afraid Franklin Roosevelt would go after them with an enemies list. And so the American Liberty League opposed the New Deal, calling it a violation of personal and property rights. Now they are challenging FDR from the right. They are the conservatives of the Democratic Party. But he's also going to face a challenge from the left. The most vocal of the anti-New Dealers, not that the New Deal isn't valid, but that the New Deal didn't go far enough, is Huey Long. Huey Long, a senator from Louisiana, former governor of Louisiana. He would be elected to the Senate as a supporter of the New Deal. He was a shrewd lawyer. He was an excellent politician. And I need to put that in quote, excellent politician. That's kind of like saying an excellent skunk. You know, it's good at what it does, but what it does sometimes isn't good. So an excellent politician. Long's support for FDR quickly waned, and by 1935, Huey Long is posing a challenge to FDR for the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1936. Long unveiled a program, which is on the button there. He called his legislative program Share Our Wealth. The program was generous to the nth degree. It called for the confiscation of large fortunes. Any family that owned hereditary fortunes, the government would confiscate that and they would redistribute it to the people in $5,000 increments. Every family would receive $5,000. Every worker would be guaranteed a $2,500 annual income. It would provide pensions to the elderly, so a precursor to Social Security, a pension for the elderly, reduced working hours. It called for a payment of the veterans bonus, and it assured a college education to every qualified student. Does that sound familiar? That's in the politics of today. Some of these ideas are still on the laundry list of current politicians as a carryover from the New Deal. Now, a reporter asked Huey Long, said, your numbers don't add up. If you confiscate all the wealth of all the wealthy people and redistribute it according to what you've called for, you're going to run out of money before you run out of people. It's not going to cover the expenses. And this says a lot. Long's reply was, and I quote, "Maybe somebody says I don't understand it," meaning the economics of his Share the Wealth program. Well, you don't have to understand it. Just shut your damn eyes and believe it. That's all. End quote. Huey Long very quickly became a demagogue, a person who appeals to the masses. And in that appeal to the masses, he created across the nation Share Our Wealth clubs that had attracted some 7.5 million followers. 7.5 dues-paying members to the Share Our Wealth clubs. That is a huge, huge following for any potential candidate. But by no means is he the only one. The next challenger to Franklin Roosevelt is Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend was a California doctor, and he only has one agenda item. It's pensions for the elderly. He called upon the government to provide old age pensions. In 1934, he promoted the Townsend Plan, calling upon the federal government to pay a $200 a month pension to every retired American citizen over the age of 60, who would then promise to spend the money within the month. Government gives the elderly $200. They have to spend all $200 in the month, and that would stimulate the economy. Once again, a pension for the elderly. Huey Long, pension for the elderly. I see a common theme here. Critics questioned Townsend. They said, wait a minute. You're going to take a program, in running the numbers of your program is going to take up 50% of the federal budget to support 9% of the populace. Townsend's response, I quote, "I'm not in the least interested in the cost of the plan." End quote. And to paraphrase Huey Long, just shut your damn eyes and believe it. These demagogues, they have their issue, but they don't believe in the economy. They don't believe in a sound spending program. They just appeal to the masses that we're going to give you something for nothing. And then compound that with the third opponent to Franklin Roosevelt, Father Charles Coughlin. Coughlin was a Roman Catholic priest who was known as the radio priest of Detroit. He founded an organization called the National Union for Social Justice in 1934. And he called upon the federal government to do a number of things. First off, unlimited coinage of silver to create inflation. Heard of that before? Now, we may be off the gold standard, but he's calling for silver production and thus inflating the currency with sound money, gold and silver, not just paper. In addition, he said that all of the nation's ills were caused by Jewish bankers and Jewish merchants. And so at the same time that Adolf Hitler in Europe is blaming the Jews for the conditions in the Weimar Republic and in Germany, Father Coughlin, parroting those ideas, says we have the same problem here in the United States. As one author said, Coughlin engaged in growing overtones of anti-Semitism. Really? That's not overtones of anti-Semitism. That is anti-Semitism. He would be cautioned by the Roman Catholic Church to be careful about blending politics and religion. He ultimately ignored them and was censured by the church. But if you put the three together, the growing support of Huey Long, the support of Coughlin, the support of Townsend, and then the opposition of the American Liberty League, who probably would never support someone like Huey Long, but they may just stay home, so their votes are going to go away from Franklin Roosevelt. You're looking at a very serious challenge to Franklin Roosevelt for the 1936 nomination. And so the Republicans, in finding someone to challenge Roosevelt, have to find someone that is not controversial and not someone who will rock the boat and turn voters against the Republican Party. And so later we'll look at the election of 1936. But with that in mind, with this opposition in mind, Roosevelt's got to find a way to stem the hemorrhaging of supporters. And one of the ways that is accomplished, and Roosevelt may or may not have been involved, but the assassination of Huey Long. Huey Long, returning to Louisiana to woo voters, visited the Louisiana State House, which he still controlled by an iron fist from Washington. But Huey Long will be shot supposedly by an assassin in the hallways of the Capitol building in Baton Rouge. I've been to this area. It's marble-lined walls. And supposedly an assassin walked up, drew a pistol, and shot at Long, with the bullet ricocheting around the halls and either hitting Long directly or ricocheting into Long. Long had a group of bodyguards with him, though, and one theory is that Long wasn't assassinated by an assassin. He was shot by one of the bodyguards, which, considering the list of enemies that Long had, could have been anybody. But the one who benefited the most, and I'm not saying he was involved, but the one who benefited the most by Long's death was Franklin Roosevelt. And so with the death of Long, Franklin Roosevelt is able to absorb a lot of the issues that the Republicans would use against him. Two of those issues are Social Security and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which we'll talk about in a minute. But both of them are proposed and approved before the election of 1936. Social Security is an attempt to bring Townsend supporters back in the fold, to bring Long supporters back in the fold, and so that no demagogue arises to challenge Roosevelt. And so in the 1936 election, the party friend, the candidate of the Republican Party, was Alfred Landon. If your name is Alf, you probably should find a pseudonym to run for president. But Alf Landon, running as a moderate Republican, who agrees with most of the New Deal, just disagrees in certain areas. In other words, he's New Deal light, taking on Franklin Roosevelt, the New Dealer. And on election day, the public responds. You know, ironically, the Gallup people in taking Gallup polling before this election had Landon down in a landslide, that Landon was going to win the 1936 election in a landslide. And so in analyzing afterwards why they lost, they realized that the way they used their poll sample was based upon people sending in a card out of a magazine. And that magazine card, do you support Alf Landon or Franklin Roosevelt, sent in before the election, had overwhelmingly said the American populace loved Landon. Problem is, only the moderately wealthy and wealthy bought magazines. So the poor voters who didn't buy magazines and couldn't send in the card and couldn't afford the postage if they did have the card, didn't send it in, but they overwhelmingly turned out for Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt will take office again for his second term, January 20th, 1937, with the American people supporting the New Deal rather than the New Deal light. And Roosevelt, keeping some of his cabinet, replacing others, will then oversee what some historians say began in late 35, early 36 as an answer to his challenges going into the election, that Roosevelt began the Second New Deal. And one of the key elements of the Second New Deal was the Social Security Administration. Social Security was a pension plan that allowed retired people over the age of 65 and their survivors to receive a pension. Beginning in 1937, workers and employers would contribute payroll taxes to the Social Security Administration. When you get your direct deposit slip, paycheck slip, or when you get your paycheck from your employer, if you get it in paper, it includes a slip that says all of the taxes taken out of it, the federal income tax, and then the next one is Social Security tax. Well, that was implemented in 1937 with the tax being taken out in 37, and once again, you can see as the economy is seeming to go trend upward, you have the imposition of this tax on employer and employee, and then a dip in the economy. The employer is going to pass that tax on to the consumer, so your cost of goods is going to go up. And then the employee, you're pulling money out of his check, so he can't go buy those goods. So as Amity Shlaes says in The Forgotten Man, the Social Security Act is one of those acts that created greater depression than fixed the depression. Benefits payments started in 1940 and averaged $22 per month. Now Roosevelt knows that this is a modest sum, and it's not going to supply everyone, but what he says is it was not intended and designed to replace all other income. He said it was just to protect the elderly from, I quote, the hazards and vicissitudes of life, end quote. The hazards and vicissitudes of life. In the early 2000s, when George W. Bush, as president, tried to fix Social Security, one of the big complaints against his proposed privatization of some of Social Security is that it would hurt those who rely on Social Security as their pension. It was never designed to be your retirement. It was designed to help you in your retirement. So in making it relevant to today, we still feel Social Security is called the third rail of politics. Don't think of that as a fence to step up on, the third rail of politics. Think of it as an electrical subway where you have the two rails the train travels on, and the third rail is the rail in the middle where power is generated. And if you put your hands on that middle rail, that third rail, you're going to electrocute yourself. any politician who talks about Social Security reform in a negative way, as in cutting it out or reducing it, is grabbing that third rail of politics. And that is by design. Listen to Roosevelt's response to one person's question. Since the tax is paid by the employer and the employee, somebody asked him, well, why don't you have the employer pay it all? Why take anything out of the employee's check? FDR replied, and I quote, "We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a moral, legal, and political right to collect their pensions and their unemployment benefits. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program." End quote. The problem is, Social Security almost didn't make it to the table. Social Security was almost killed by the Supreme Court. Now hold that thought, because another creation of the Roosevelt administration was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. This is a rural electrification program to build a system of dams and locks on the various rivers in northern Georgia, northern Alabama, all through Tennessee, elements of Virginia, North Carolina, and then through those dams and the hydroelectric dams built on them to generate power that would feed all of those states. And you can see the outline on the map. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a government entity buying up the land, building the dams, running the TVA, which was a move beyond the federal government's powers that had ever been used before. Regardless of whether it was good or ill, it was a government reach for power that's going to be challenged in court. Because these are the two staple items of the Second New Deal, the Supreme Court becomes instrumental in the New Deal legislation. Now, we had the Schuster case in which it was a unanimous decision, but in U.S. versus Butler, you had the four horsemen with the balance declaring the law, the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional, and you had the Three Musketeers saying it was constitutional. So you have a divided court. In most of the cases that came before the Supreme Court, you got this 6-3 split, with Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes leading the majority, writing the majority opinions against the New Deal. Remember, he was a Republican presidential nominee in 1916. He was a Republican governor. He was also a reformer, but in this case, whether motivated by party politics or truly by the Constitution, he is the guiding force against the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, fearful that his key programs are going to be killed, without consulting Congress and without consulting the Supreme Court certainly, Roosevelt calls for an expansion of the court. It was called court packing. On February 5th, 1937, Roosevelt called for the expansion of the Supreme Court from its 9 members to 15 members, with 6 new members being added to the court. Now, go back to the Constitution. What does the Constitution say? Well, it gives the control and the scope and composition of the court is given to Congress. So the Congress will decide yay or nay, but it is the President who will initiate the expansion of the court, which is entirely constitutional. Then Congress will decide, and if they had decided to expand the court, that gives Roosevelt 6 more justices to put on the court. With those 6 justices, which he will pick and then Congress will approve, and a Democrat Congress, Democrat Senate, Democrat House, they're not going to reject any of FDR's nominees. He's going to effectively, with the existing 3, control 9 votes on the Supreme Court, and anything Papa FDR wants, Papa FDR will get. To put it in another perspective, the only branch of government Roosevelt doesn't control, because his party controls the House, it controls the Senate, it controls the presidency, the only part of the government he doesn't control is the court. And so when he announces this, and in very antagonistic language, calls the Supreme Court a collection of old men, even angering his supporters on the court, Roosevelt's court-packing scheme backfires. And the social outcry, the people rejecting it, Congress then rejects it, and FDR is handed an overwhelming loss, and it breaks Roosevelt's stride. As Henry Wallace, future Vice President Henry Wallace said, the whole New Deal really went up in smoke as a result of the Supreme Court fight. In fact, the back of the second New Deal was broken, and Roosevelt's going to have a tougher time getting any legislation through Congress, and especially major projects. But the simple fact is, Roosevelt had gotten most, if not everything, and by the way, the court, in a move to throw Roosevelt a bone, the court will ultimately decide that the Social Security Administration is good and that the TVA is good, and so they're passed and implemented. But Roosevelt's gotten most of everything that he wants, and even though there will be little bits and pieces along the way, the focus of the nation is now off of relief, recovery, and reform. The nation is increasingly turning to world events. And so as we head toward the next election, the election of 1940, world events are playing out in the late 1930s that show the world is a dangerous place. And as America decides whether it's going to get involved in the crisis that's then occurring or not, it's no longer on reform. Before we leave, let's look at 4 results of the New Deal. Just in closing, 4 results of the New Deal. First, the New Deal, without a doubt, without this being opinion, the New Deal expanded the powers and control of the federal government far beyond what had ever existed before. It took the ideas of progressivism and that you can change society and expanded it to new degrees. Secondly, as a positive, you could say it restored hope in the system. People who were leaning communist and leaning against the New Deal now supported it, and now supported the government, gave the capitalist system some credence. It seemed to be under control. Third, the view of government had changed. How the average American viewed the scope of government. They saw that government played a role in their lives, that government could regulate, government could change, government could transform. And now they not only don't fear government, they want government involvement. And then fourth, it permanently entrenched the welfare state. It replaced the old laissez-faire, hands-off. It replaced community assistance. It replaced local assistance and neighborhood assistance with federal government welfare. So for good or ill, the New Deal transformed American society. All right, we are done.